بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah. In our lessons on Jawhara al-Tawhid with the commentary of Imam Sawi rahimahullah ta'ala, we have reached the section on how we practically reflect. How we practically reflect. And this is a beautiful section. It's a rational argument, but it's clothed in a beautiful manner. For referential purposes, those of us who were together in the class on the Kharida al-Bahiyya, he has a discussion in the Kharida and its commentary on reflection as well, early on. So it's good to make a habit as a student of knowledge to make these interconnections, right, between texts. Those who have sort of further aspiration, you can look in Qawa'id al-Aqaid of Imam al-Ghazali, which is also translated into English. There's in part 3, Imam al-Ghazali discusses the lines of reasoning by which one arrives at belief in God, right? And those are very useful. So one is to review the section on the Kharida, and someone could share. Those of you who are new, if you request access, we have a group for the Kharida, for this class, so that way you have access to the resources and so on. So we can share, if we take the Shannar edition as a standard, we can share where it is. See, Zain, if you could do that, right? That the Shannar edition could just be in the docs and files, right? Or wherever, like just have it uploaded, that you can find it in pages this and this, right? And we can include Sharh Hashiyat al-Sawi on that for those who'd like to look further. So that consolidates. Then another useful resource is Qawa'id al-Aqaid, which is book 2 of the Ihya. And the book 2 of the Ihya, of course, has a very, very, we covered it at the at Seekers some time ago, and it's available on Seekers as a course. And there sometimes you can take a course just to get some part of it, right? Book 3 is very useful. Part 3, because Imam al-Ghazali first presents the core beliefs in the foundations of Islamic beliefs. Then he goes into some issues related to the acquisition of faith, right? And how children are taught belief, etc. That's chapter number 2. And some issues related to issues and understandings related to faith. Part 3, Imam al-Ghazali looks at the proofs for those beliefs. And part 4 is supplementary issues like the relationship between Islam and Iman, etc. But part 3 is related to this in terms of some of the proofs related to belief, and these are useful particularly at a general level, right? At a general level, and what you'll find, and it's disappointing, most people do not think deeply, right? And that's just a reality, right? As much as those intellectually inclined would wish otherwise, most people aren't that deeply inquisitive. Otherwise, more people would actively believe or would more actively disbelieve. But most people are just getting on with life. So they're not going to, بَلْ أَكْثَرُهُمْ لَا يَعْقِلُونَ. They don't think that, it's as sad as it is. But some of them don't think and they won't bother to think, and some don't think and they'll only think a little bit. And of course, we are intellectually honest and we don't deceive people, etc. But we need to know that not everyone needs the ultimate guide to Fakhruddin al-Razi's intricate proofs, right? right? And that's a reality that we have to be aware of. So these are useful supplements, right? These are useful supplements. The Imam Ghazali's Foundations of Islamic Belief, Qa'id al-Aqaid is ably translated into English by Sheikh Abdul Hadi Honorkamp, I believe, as part of the Fonds Vitae series. And so we've talked about Sharh al-Imam al-Dardir, number 2, from Imam al-Ghazali, part 3 of Imam al-Ghazali's Ihya. Then as a practical exercise, right, and we should make a commitment to this. We've mentioned these verses before, but there's two things that we need to bring into our devotional practice at a personal level. There are two sunnahs of the Prophet ﷺ, one more emphasized than the other. The first is that to recite the closing verses of Surah Al-Baqarah on a daily basis. And the closing verses, the more precautionary thing is to recite the last 3 verses, not just the last 2. Because it's come in hadith that the Prophet ﷺ referred to them as the last 2 verses, but they've also been referred to in Arabic by the Prophet ﷺ as khawatimul baqarah, the closing verses. And the minimum plural in Arabic is 3. That was a trick. 3. This finger took a while to come up, right? So 3 verses, right? And also because the number, while the order of the Quran is tawqifi by scholarly consensus, the order of the Quran is tawqifi, is revealed, the numbering is not revealed. And that's why there's actually ikhtilaf between, there's different methods of numbering the Quran. Generally, there's limited difference now, but there are, even like with respect from the different methods of that, there's difference on the numbering of Surah Al-Baqarah, of one verse. And earlier there was more difference on it. But, so even there, the joining between the Prophet ﷺ referred to them as 2 verses, because thematically there's 2. Right? The third last verse, لِلَّهِ مَا فِي السَّمَوَاتِ وَمَا فِي الْأَرْضِ. Allah's is all that is in the heavens and all that is on earth. Right? And it's an amazing verse. For those who, these are things where we can explore on our own. Al-Kamal ibn Abi Sharif has a mid-sized commentary, about 150 pages, explaining these closing 3 verses. It's really beautiful. Shaykh Abdullah Sirajuddin has a tafsir of these closing verses. We'll share the link to that. The tafsir of Khawatim al-Baqarah by Shaykh Abdullah Sirajuddin, who's one of the great scholars of the 20th century, one of the most distinguished scholars of hadith above all, but he has a whole slew of works on tafsir that are precious. And this is one of the more neglected ones. But practically, to read these verses with reflection, and they tell us about the nature of our relationship with Allah, and thematic, Allah's is all in the heavens and all on earth. It lays out the nature of our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay. So, where did we stopped at? So we took فَانْظُرْ إِلَى نَفْسِكَ ثُمَّ انْتَقِلِي لِلْعَالَمِ الْعُلْوِ ثُمَّ السُّفْلِ. So look at yourself. And of course, this is the look of reflection. You can translate as look or reflect. Or فَانْظُرْ, direct your reason to yourself. Right? And then turn to the higher worlds and then the lower. You'll find in it a creation, badi'a, unique and marvelous. Al-Hikam, as we mentioned, Sawi did not explain it. We pointed that look at what Bajuri and others mention. Badi'a al-Hikam, it's either, Hikam here is plural of ihkam, of perfection, or Badi'a, which is theologically more sound, Iman-wise, hikmah, to behold the wisdom of Allah's creation, and the two are interrelated. Because hikmah is for everything to be in its right place. What? Appreciating divine wisdom is the perfect divine alignment of Allah's knowledge, will, and power. Right? And Imam Ghazali in Qawa'id al-Aqaid and elsewhere talks about divine wisdom in that sense. Okay. But in it lies the proof of its nothingness. Why is there proof of its nothingness in creation? We said to reflect on that. Why would it be? لكن به قام دليل العدم. What in creation points to its origination or to its nothingness?
Can be its attributes, that it has a beginning and it has an end.
No, but let's say you come over here. What if this wall behind us was eternal? Do you have any proof that Lake Ontario is not eternal? Yeah, what should the answer be? The answer should be yes, definitely. Did you see the creation of Lake Ontario? No. Right? لكن به قام دليل العدم. But in it lies the proof of its non-existence. What is that proof? Why is it mumkin?
Because it's possible for it to have not existed.
Why? Because it's possible. So when I look at Lake Ontario, I say this is created. I didn't witness it. What about it tells me that it's created? Yeah. So, and this is what he'll tell us, like وَكُلُّ مَا جَازَ عَلَيْهِ الْعَدَمْ عَلَيْهِ يَسْتَحِيلُ الْقِدَمْ. That anything for which it's possible not to exist, it's impossible for it to be eternal. But it goes back to the reality that anything, all things, right, are ajram and a'rad. All things are bodies with attributes, right? Anything, because normally we don't think about just dots, jawahir, essences, right? Things, a wall, a lake, they are things and they have their attributes. You cannot think of anything, what the theologians call an essence, a jirm, a jawhar, right, without attributes, right? This is, did we share the line from Sharh al-Kharida? Yeah.
I mentioned the page.
Zida maqama man fakka ma kamuna, etc. Right? So this is man fakka. It's inseparable, right? That all entities, you cannot think of anything that is a thing without any attributes. And the attributes of something, any attribute that you could affirm for something, it accepts having other than that attribute. So the attributes are mutaghayyir, are changing, either actually or possibly. So therefore, the attributes of things are merely possible, right? Say, no, I've weighed 250 pounds last 5 years. It doesn't go up and down. But could it? Yeah. Or anything. The wall, the mountain, the lake, anything. This universe, right? It is the way it is, but it accepts other attributes. Therefore, but then essences are inseparable from attributes. All attributes are originated because they're given. Burhanu hadha, what's it saying in the Kharida? لأنه قام به التغير, because it's given to change, actual or potential. Now, the attributes are given to change, so they're possible. They're not necessary, right? And essences, therefore, because the essences are inseparable from originated attributes. Therefore, essences themselves are originated. لأن اللازم الحادث حادث. That which is not free of originated things is itself originated. Unless you, the only way around that is unless you were to accept حوادث لا أول لها, infinite regress, that there could be something that something is eternal, but it eternally has ongoing attributes, and that's absurd. We'll be coming to the absurdity of. So he says, he explains this now. وَكُلُّ مَا جَازَ عَلَيْهِ الْعَدَمُ عَلَيْهِ قَطْعًا يَسْتَحِيلُ الْقِدَمُ. And anything for which it's possible not to exist could not possibly be eternal. Why? Because something for which it's possible not to exist, then what is its ruling? Is it necessary? No, it is merely possible. It's merely possible. And the possible, what is its starting point? What's the starting point of the possible? It's non-existence. Whereas the possible, that which could exist or could not exist, rationally the mind says it's merely possible. The scale of possibility is theoretically balanced. What's the ruling of there being a bull with 4 horns living in the brothers area over here? It's possible, but theoretically it's possible. But what's the original state? Non-existence, unless there's something to affirm it. Likewise, everything. Anything that we affirm is possible, it starts off as Adam ما لم يثبت وجوده, right? Unless its existence is affirmed. But so that's why it's hadith, right? It's originated. يعني الحادث هو الموجود بعد عدم. The hadith, the originated, is that which has existence after having been non-existent. So this وَكُلُّ مَا جَازَ عَلَيْهِ الْعَدَمُ, everything for which it's possible not to exist. He says هذه كبرى قياس مطوي الصغرى, right? So the qiyas has 2 parts. The qiyas is the rational proof, right? It's the analogy. It has 2 parts. This is one of the parts of the qiyas, and the other is not mentioned. And then there is a natija. So you have 2 parts, the sughra, the kubra, the sughra, and the natija. Right? So he says, لِدِلَالَ. And why could you remove some of it? Because some of it's obvious. Some of it's obvious. Right? Right? And this is one of the ways, this is why logic is useful. Let's say I want to construct a proof that العالم متغير وكل متغير حادث فالعالم حادث, that this world has a beginning. Right? So I want to come to this conclusion, that I want to make you agree that this world has, that the world changes. العالم متغير. وكل متغير حادث. Everything that changes is given, is originated. Therefore, the world is originated. Now, to make a good argument, one of the things you have to do, and this is not intellectual dishonesty, this is just good argument, that if someone doesn't want to accept the conclusion, I shouldn't show my cards. Say, look, let me prove this to you. They'll be like, so what you do is you focus on the point that you're trying to prove. And that's why you need to understand someone. So they accept that this world changes. That one, like would someone deny that? That change happens in this world? No. So the point that one needs to get them to is anything that changes is originated. Right? So you prove that to them. Maybe even let them talk about it. When they accept that, then we say, well, this world changes. Now we've agreed that everything that changes is originated. So this world changes, therefore it's originated. So we didn't mention the second part of the premise. Why? In one case, because we already discussed it. Here it's understood contextually. It's ma'hud. لِدِلَالَةِ قَوْلِهِ لَكِنْ بِهِ قَامَا دَلِيلُ الْعَدَمِ. But in it lies the proof of its originatedness. تَقْرِيرُهُ أَن تَقُولُ. And the way this proof is made, الْعَالَمُ جَائِزٌ عَلَيْهِ الْعَدَمِ. This world, it's possible for it not to exist. وَكُلُّ مَا جَازَ عَلَيْهِ الْعَدَمِ استحال عليه القدم. And anything for it which it's possible not to exist, it is absurd for it to be eternal. Because the eternal is that which is, must be, and cannot not be. There can only be one eternal, and that's separate. فنتج العالم استحال عليه القدم. So therefore the natija is this world, it's absurd for it to not exist. أي فيكون حادثا. So therefore it's originated. لأنه لا واسطة بين القديم والحادث. Because there's no, something is either eternal or originated. There's no other state. لأن المراد بالعالم, because what's meant by the world, or you can say the universe, right? كل ما سوى الله تعالى من الموجودات, is everything that exists besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فقط. That's it. Right? In مشينا على الراجح, if we go on the majority position, من أن الحق, that the truth is أن لا حال, that there's no thing called a state, right? And this goes into something called maratib al-wujud, the levels of existence. And we don't need to get into it, you don't need to worry about it. Basically, there are three levels. You have adam and wujud. You have something either exists or it doesn't exist, right? Something either ma'doom or mawjood, right? But then the issue that some people found is, for example, when you say Zaydun qa'im, the standing of Zayd. Zayd is standing. This is a state. Does the standing have an existing of its own? So some people defined certain things that are affirmed, that they call them ahwal. Right? And we don't need to get into that. But the ulama said no, that muddies the water, and there's some philosophical underpinnings, they come in larger works. The relied upon position is that there's two states. There's لا واسطة بين العدم والوجود. But then they say there's maratib of wujud, there's levels of affirmation. And they said something exists, but it's an amr i'tibari. It's a nisba بين أمرين. Right? Like Zaydun qa'im. Zayd is standing. Can you point to the standing itself? No, you're pointing to Zayd. Zayd exists. The qiyam is an amr i'tibari. It's a nisba of Zayd to other things. So anyways, that's a separate, so they just said no, its existence. What do we say about the qiyam of Zayd is affirmed, right? And then there's some things that are umur i'tibariya, and then there's ما له تحقق في الخارج, right? And so that's a separate discussion that comes, which are levels of existence, right? That some things are conceptual and others are externally affirmed. And those who'd like to read more on it, it's in the footnote. وَأَمَّا إِن مَشِينَا عَلَى مَذْهَبِ مَنْ يُثْبِتُ الْأَحْوَالِ. As for if we take the way of those who affirm this, that there's adam and wujud, and in between there is the hal, فنقول العالم كل ما سوى الله تعالى من الموجودات والأحوال. That the world is all that's besides Allah of existent things and states. فالمعدومات على كل حال ليست من العالم. So the things that don't exist are not of this world. فلا يقال الشريك الباري من العالم. Right? So there's no co-share with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with respect to that. Okay. So that is the issue of إذ كل ما جاز عليه العدم عليه قطعا يستحيل القدم. Okay? And this is the insight of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam. لا أحب الآفلين. I do not love things that wane. I love not things that perish. And what perishes? كل من عليها فان. Everything upon it is perishing. And of course, fan, fani, right? From Surah Ar-Rahman, right? كل من عليها فان ويبقى وجه ربك ذي الجلال والإكرام. وجه ربك ذي الجلال, right? ذو الجلال والإكرام. تبارك اسم ربك ذي الجلال والإكرام. So ويبقى وجه ربك ذو الجلال والإكرام. Right? وجهه ذاته. Right? Allah's, as al-Baydawi explains in his tafsir, and this عليه جمهور المفسرين. Right? Right? الوجه in classical Arabic, وجه الشيء is يعبر به عن جملته وذاته. Okay? And Allah Himself remains. ذو الجلال والإكرام. كل من عليها فان. All that is upon it is perishing. And fan is حقيقة في الحال مجاز في الاستقبال. It's perishing now. Why? Because it's merely possible. And we'll see that investigation when we come to the investigations on existence. So you just put a footnote there. Connect this to what's come. فواجب له الوجود والقدم, etc. in a few lines. Okay. Then he says in line number 18, وَفُسِّرَ الْإِيمَانُ بِالتَّصْدِيقِ وَالنُّطْقُ فِيهِ الْخُلْفُ بِالتَّحْقِيقِ. Right? And Iman is explained as being tasdeeq, as being confirmation. As for uttering one's faith, there is actual difference of opinion about. So, فُسِّرَ, right? أي فسر علماء أهل السنة, the ulama of أهل السنة have explained, والفسر هو الكشف. Or they say that's what التفسير هو الكشف عن حقائق المعاني. يعني الحقائق والمعاني. Right? Because يعني فسر in Arabic refers to uncovering something. So you just, you see just the surface meaning of something, but fasr is to uncover, so you see the reality of it. And fassara yufassiru tafsiran. وفسر الإيمان, right? Now, Iman, so we took that, واجزم بأن أولا مما يجب معرفة. You must know God. But knowing God is not sufficient. يعرفونه كما يعرفون أبناءهم. Did that ma'rifah benefit them? They know Him as they know their very children. But did that knowledge avail them? No. Referring to the disbelievers who knew the truth of what the Prophet ﷺ came with. So they say, what is Iman? They say, Al-Iman hadithu nafs at-tabi' lil-ma'rifah. Right? Iman is that self-affirmation that comes after knowing. So there's the truth. Right? We affirm that the truth is intrinsically true. Right? The al-haq laysa nisbiyan. The truth is not relative. That you have your truth and I have my truth, and the person saying the opposite of me has their truth. It's not truth anymore. Right? An opinion could be multiple opinions. There could be multiple understandings. But the truth itself is one. It is one. In the things that are irreconcilable. Right? So the first step is to know that truth. That's ma'rifah. And we've talked about ma'rifah and how you come to know that. But once you come to know that, what's the next step? Is to accept that. That acceptance is called Iman. Right? That acceptance is Iman. Right? And sometimes that truth is not easy to accept. Just share it, inshallah. Right. That truth is not always easy to accept. Because there are things that prevent the acceptance of truth. Wahb ibn Munabbih, one of the early Salaf, he said that he read in the books of wisdom, قرأت في الحكمة للكفر أربعة أركان. There are 4 causes of disbelief. What are they? ركن منه الغضب. One integral of disbelief is anger. You hate something, or you're upset with something. And there's things that stir anger. You get angry, then Another is ركن منه الشهوة. Another is desire. Someone told a friend of mine that, look, I can't believe I'm Irish and I drink. And I can't give up drinking. So my friend told him, look, continue drinking but just become a believer anyways. Right? And then we can talk about So, but what about the drinking? He said, we're not going to talk about it. And he meant right now. A little while later, he came up. There's shahawat. Whether for physical desires or desire for wealth or status or so many things. وَرُكْنٌ مِنْهُ الطَّمَعُ, avidness. حُبُّ الْجَاهِ وَالْمَنْزِلَةِ. Right? وَرُكْنٌ مِنْهُ الْخَوْفِ. And another integral of this belief is fear. Fear of losing or fear of the other. Right? Okay. So this is so Iman. Now, وفسر الإيمان أي الشرعي. The Iman that is recognized in the Sharia. So Imam Sawi rahimahullah says, لما كان الإيمان والإسلام من مباحث هذا الفن. When Iman and Islam are from the investigations of this subject, al-Aqidah. بل هما المقصود منه. Rather, these are the purpose. Why do we study Aqidah? لإثبات وتقوية الإيمان. Right? To affirm and strengthen faith. استشعر أي المؤلف سؤال سائل عنهما. So the author felt that now someone would logically ask a question regarding what is Iman and what is Islam. فأجاب بما ذكر. So he responded with this line. والإيمان لغة مطلق التصديق. Iman in lugha is to confirm something is true. آمنت أي قبلت وصدقت. يعني Iman is to confirm something is true. Right? In general. واصطلاحا, but which? Acceptance. Right? So someone believes that the Raptors are the best team in the NBA right now. Do we say they're a mu'min? But they are a mu'min, but they're mu'minun bil Raptors, not mu'minun bima ja'a bihi Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Because what is iman? Is to accept as true what the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam came with. So that's why واصطلاحا أي الإيمان المقصود في يعني من مباحث العقائد is تصديق النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فيما جاء به مما علم من الدين بالضرورة. Is to confirm as true that the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم in that which he came with of that which is necessarily known to be of the religion. So مدار الإيمان على تصديق النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم ومدار الكفر على عدم تصديقه. Right? The faith revolves around accepting as true what the Messenger صلى الله عليه وسلم has come with. And the basis of kufr is non-acceptance. Right? Is non-acceptance. And we'll look that this belief has at least 4 levels. One is عدم التصديق. Right? It's just not believing. منهم مؤمن ومنهم كافر. Right? There's some of them who believe and some who don't. You either have this, you either confirm as true what the Messenger came with, or you have non-belief. You could have non-belief, which is simply you don't confirm. Maybe the message didn't reach you, you didn't even think about it. Or you have not just عدم التصديق, but you have تكذيب. You deny. Then you have تكذيب مع عداوة. You have disbelief with enmity. And then you have تكذيب مع عداوة ومحاربة, and to fight belief. And broadly, we are clear that non-believers are at 4 levels. You have non-belief, you have disbelief with enmity, and then you have disbelief with actual fighting of faith. So when we ask Allah, وَانْصُرْنَا عَلَى الْقَوْمِ الْكَافِرِينَ, grant us victory over those who disbelieve, we do not mean our neighbor, the neighbor in our who's opposite us in our new apartment, who we've just said, how are you doing? You want victory over them? No, you want guidance for them. Right? Because the L there is referential. Anyways, here, but the Prophet ﷺ came with a lot. A subset of what he came with is what's called al-ma'lum min ad-din bid-darura. This comes up towards the end of the text. The ma'lum min ad-din bid-darura are the core teachings that he came with that are clearly, they're decisively established and clearly known, such that they're known both by the learned and the unlearned. Right? And that comes up later in the text. He tells us, it's on page, you will see in the footnote the reference to the page number here, and he quotes Tuhfat al-Murid is by Imam al-Bajuri. It's probably the greatest commentary on Jawhara al-Tawhid in terms of explaining. And these are things that everybody knows, even a non-Muslim would tell you, that who has even a basic idea of Islam, right? كالصلاة والصيام والزكاة والحج, like prayer and fasting and zakat and hajj. That's Iman. The author adds something, which is وَالْإِسْلَامُ لُغَةً مُطْلَقُ الْإِنْقِيَادِ. Islam in Arabic is to surrender to something. It's to surrender. Any type of surrender. يقال أسلمت الدابة واستسلمت بمعنى انقادت. So it's an animal that was out of control and then it surrendered. You can say أسلمت or استسلمت. Right? And both are good. Both have interchangeable meanings. So it's the idea of surrendering to something. Right? Surrendering to something. That's the general meaning. واصطلاحا الانقياد إلى ما جاء به النبي صلى الله تعالى عليه وسلم مما علم ضرورة. Right? It's to surrender and submit to that which the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم has come with, of that which is necessarily known to be of the religion. So there is a truth. Right? There is a truth. Iman relates to accepting it as true. It's to accept it as true. Right? It's knowledge plus accepting that truth. Tasdeeq. Al-qabul ma'al-id'an. Right? Confirmation with acceptance. Islam is to surrender to that truth. Now, Imam Abu Hanifa simplified it, and this is the sort of the position taken by the Maturidis, is that so the Maturidis put in their text that al-Islam wal-Imanu wahid, straight up. Insofar as Islam and Iman are one, insofar as in their basic reality, you cannot have Iman without Islam. Iman itself. Without Islam, and you cannot have Islam without Iman. You can have apparent Iman without Islam, such that someone claims Iman, but they don't submit. But there, it's just apparent Iman, that they say, I believe, but they don't actually. Right? But the reality of Iman itself, right, cannot be found without Islam, and Islam itself cannot be found without Iman. Where one is absent, it's because the other is only apparently there. So someone could be can have apparent Islam. They pray, they fast, etc., but they don't believe. They just coerced into doing it by their parents or something. So they have Islam, but they don't have Iman in its reality. So you can complicate this, like the logical breakdown of it. One way of looking at Iman and Islam is that there are two possibilities. There's apparent and actual. Right? So the only time Islam and Iman where you can find one without the other, is if one or the other are simply apparent and not real. Right? And you can work through the logical possibility. Apparent faith, apparent Iman can only be found with what? With apparent Islam. So someone is just faking it because they're stuck in a coercive society. And that's a sad reality in some places, where there's too much outward formalism without a focus on غرس حقائق الدين. It's just, you know, if you shove religion down people's throats, they'll just vomit it out secretly, right? Like there's, نسأل الله العافية. So, but then he tells us that فالإسلام انقياد ظاهري ناشئ عن تصديق باطني. That Islam is an outward surrender that arises from an inward confirmation of truth. Right? This is يعني من حيث الاستعمال العام. Right? This is in terms of the general use. Generally, when we talk about Islam, we are talking about outward submission. Right? It's an outward submission that arises from an inward confirmation of truth. But in reality, both Islam and Iman are actions of the heart. They are interrelated actions of the heart. Why? Because it's possible to have this inqiyadun. Islam is an inward surrender that is typically outwardly manifest. But what if someone didn't pray or fast, they didn't stick to any of the halal and haram, are they still a Muslim? Yes. You cannot have someone who's at this level of A or B, Muslim or not. It's not possible to have a Muslim who's not a mu'min, and it's not possible to have a mu'min who's not a Muslim. And in this sense, al-Iman wal-Islam are, in of themselves, they are one. Right? And you can find that in al-Fiqh al-Akbar, for example, of Imam Abu Hanifa, or other texts. They mention the works of the Maturidis. Is there in the Tariq al-Muhammadiyah? We'll be coming to it soon. Al-Islam al-Iman wal-Islam are one, in terms of their core meaning. Right? وَالْإِيمَانِ تَصْدِيقٌ بَاطِنِي. And Iman is an inward confirmation of truth. يَنْشَأْ عَنْهُ إِنْقِيَادٌ ظَاهِرِ. That is manifest in an outward surrender. فَتَغَايَرَا مَفْهُومًا. So they are distinct in their meaning. وَلَكِنْ بَيْنَهُمَا تَلَازُمٌ. But they are interrelated. This is discussed at length in the fourth part of Imam al-Ghazali's Foundations of Islamic Guidance. If you want to really get a bit of a mental exercise, because he goes into different possibilities. And Habib Ali al-Jifri has a short treatise on this, on the relationship between Islam and Iman, where he clarifies the issue quite well. And that's online, both the PDF in Arabic and the translation in English. Then, before we move on to discuss Iman, both Iman and Islam have, so one way of looking at each is that there's actual Iman and there's apparent Iman, which is you just say with your tongue that you're a believer, but you don't believe in your heart. Apparent Iman. Islam, that you just say, I'm a Muslim, but you don't actually accept the surrender. And we don't have to open anyone's heart. The Prophet condemned the Sahabi radiallahu ta'ala anhu, who killed someone who just stated the Shahada, هَلَّا شَقَقْتَ قَلْبَهُ. That didn't you open up his heart? Or did you open his heart to judge that he wasn't actually a believer? Right? We judge by the outward. But another way of looking at Iman and Islam, that each has three levels. So Iman has, there's faith itself, there are the fruits of faith, and there is the perfection of faith. Right? So Iman itself is at-tasdeeq. You can, right? Yani nafsul iman is at-tasdeeq. You confirm as true what the Messenger ﷺ has come with. This iman then has, and this is like the seed. That seed, if cultivated, has branches. Right? These are the fruits of faith. It becomes fruitful. تُؤْتِي أُكُلَهَا, right? And the metaphor from Surah Ibrahim, the 14th surah, it's like verse 14 or so, right? That the example of the good word is like the good tree. أَصْلُهَا ثَابِت, its root is firm, وَفَرْعُهَا فِي السَّمَاءِ, and its branches are in the heavens. These, as cultivated, these are the fruits of faith, or the branches and fruits of faith. That is, al-iman al-muthmir, right? Al-iman al-muthmir. Yeah, these are the darajat of salah, of righteousness. And that's the second consideration. That has to do with strength of faith and the fruits of faith. There are awsaf of this iman. There are qualities of this faith. For those who'd like to look at what some of these awsaful iman are, they're discussed in the branches of faith. There's inward qualities, inward branches of faith, and outward branches of faith. Our dear teacher Shaykh Badib, who's arriving in a couple of hours, he taught the branches of faith by Imam Muhammad Murtada al-Zabidi at the Old Seekers in Arabic, and a number of people did the translating of that. And there's the branches of faith. There's some core branches which are which you can call awsaful iman, like hope and fear and gratitude and love. Right? These are some of the Salaf refer to them as awsaful iman, right? Because there's faith itself, and there's these inward qualities, and there's outward expressions. These are all the branches of faith. And then there is kamalul iman, right? Which is reaching the station of muraqabah and then mushahada, and that kamalul iman has degrees as well. There's no ending to that. So faith has been broken down into three levels. Iman, there's nafsul iman, and then there's thamaratul iman, or imanul muthmir, and these are the iman of the salihin. And then there's there's al-imanul kamil, which is imanul muqarrabin, right? Which is to be in a state of iman, either في مقام المراقبة فاعلم أن that ألم يعلم بأن الله يرى, right? And then فإن لم تكن تراه فإنه يراك, to be متحقق with that reality. And the pinnacle of faith is to reach the degrees of أن تعبد الله كأنك تراه, to worship Allah as though you behold. So that's Iman, and we talked about, and that another way of looking at it, that's Iman plus Yaqeen. These are all the darajat. These are this is how you cultivate Yaqeen and the perfection of Yaqeen. Okay. Islam as well there's Islam itself, right? Which is this inqiyad, this inward acceptance to submit. Then there are the outward acts of submission, which are thamaratul Islam, right? Which is to the degree that you actively submit in your obligations and your recommendations. And then there is kamalul Islam, right? And there's interrelationships between the two, which la nihayata laha, because you can complicate this as much as you want, but none of it ultimately matters, right? These are lived realities, right? So he says, فإذا علمت أن الإيمان تصديق النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم مما جاء به مما صار كالمعلوم بالضرورة تعلم أنه يجب الإيمان بالأنبياء والرسل. If you know that Iman, faith, is to confirm as true the Prophet ﷺ in that which he came with, of that which is necessarily known to be of the religion, then you also know that it is obligatory to believe in the prophets and messengers. وَلَا يَعْلَمُ عِدَّتَهُمْ إِلَّا اللَّهُ عَلَى الصَّحِيحِ. And nobody knows their count except Allah Himself, according to the sound opinion. And we'll be looking at that when we look at the prophets. Because there are individual hadiths related, mentioning the number of the prophets. We accept those hadiths as sound, but there's a difference. Iman itself is built on only decisive evidence. Sound hadiths are obligatory to act upon, obligatory to accept, but there's degrees of acceptance. Okay? So the things that are affirmed by individual texts, or that are open to interpretation, those are called furu'ul iman. Okay? They're usulul iman. Usulul iman لا تثبت إلا بالنصوص القطعية. The foundations of faith are only affirmed by decisive texts. The clear verses of the Quran and the mass transmitted hadith. Things affirmed by singular texts or by texts open to potential interpretation, such that there's different opinion about, those things may affirm details of faith but not the fundamentals. That's a separate investigation. Okay. So he says, وَيَجِبُ الْإِيمَانُ تَفْصِيلًا بِمَنِ اشْتُهِرَ مِنْهُمْ. It is obligatory to believe in detail in those who are famous amongst them. These are the ones explicitly mentioned in the Quran. وَهُمْ خَمْسَةٌ وَعِشْرُونَ مُجْمَعٌ عَلَيْهِمْ. These are 25 that are agreed upon. وَثَلَاثَةٌ مُخْتَلَفٌ فِيهِمْ. And 3 who are disagreed upon. ثمانية عشر في آية وتلك حجتنا. And the verse is there in the footnote. What surah is it from? Surah Al-An'am. Right? Are you sure? My copy doesn't say it. That's why I'm asking. Okay. It says that in the text itself? Fil An'am, yeah. So that's my blindness. Sorry. Fil An'am. And the other 7 are وَسَيِّدُنَا Muhammad عليه السلام وسيدنا آدم عليه السلام وسيدنا صالح عليه السلام وسيدنا شعيب عليه السلام وسيدنا هود عليه السلام وسيدنا إدريس عليه السلام وسيدنا ذو الكفل عليه السلام. So these are 25. والثلاثة المختلف فيهم اختلافا شهيرا ذو القرنين ولقمان والعزير. Right? These are differed upon, and there's more differed upon than these. Because there's also a number of others, amongst them Al-Khadir. Right? And we'll come to that when we come to the right? Because there's also the Al-Khadir is differed upon, and then there's difference about a number of women amongst them. And the Salaf had, the predominant opinion is none of them there's decisive proof about. Amongst them, some of the early Muslims held that what Sayyidatuna Sarah did could only come from a prophet. So Ibn Kathir mentions this in his work on the marriages of the prophets. Right? Others said that Sayyidah Maryam and the mother of Sayyidah Maryam, Musa, in total there's at least 8 women that there's been different degrees of difference of opinion about their prophethood. None of it is established because there is insufficient proof. There's insufficient proof. But it's at least good to know, because some people get tied up in knots about something that, how come the scholars entertain the possibility? It is in itself possible, but there's insufficient proof. right? There's insufficient proof. Because otherwise, if just the mention of awhayna, we revealed, then we'd affirm the prophethood of bees, right? For example, which would be absurd. But the khilaf is there, and we'll be talking further about that when we come to it. وَيَجِبُ الْإِيمَانُ إِجْمَالًا. But of course, what does it mean to believe in them tafsilan? In that you cannot deny belief in any of these, right? You cannot deny belief in any of these. Right? Of course, we should know of these prophets and be familiar with these prophets. If you want a reading exercise of your own, and we can just put a placeholder in it for when we get to the section on prophethood, we can put it in the course day. There's a work by Shaykh Abdul Rahman Habannaka called Al-Aqidatul Islamiyya. It has a beautiful section on prophethood. But he has brief but very cogent biographies of the prophets mentioned in the Quran, the 25. Right? And that's a very useful resource. He also has useful things there about the proofs of prophethood, etc. I'm not suggesting to read it right now, but sometimes it's good to have these placeholders, so when we get to it, you're ready for it, but you can make a reference. And the other is a work by Sheikh Muhammad Ali al-Sabuni, one of the great scholars of tafsir, one of the great scholars alive, called An-Nubuwatu wal-Anbiya, Prophets and Prophethood. This is translated into English as well. The Arabic's available online. It's a very good book. He gets a little bit emotional when it comes to Sayyidina Adam and certain things, and you gotta just take a deep breath on that. But it's a really good book, right? But that's slightly longer in terms of prophets and prophethood. But this work by Sheikh Abdul Rahman Habannaka, who is the son of one of the great revivers of Islamic scholarship in Damascus, Sheikh Hassan Habannaka al-Maydani. And I lived in Maidan, and Sheikh Hassan Habannaka had died decades ago. And people were talking about Sheikh Hassan like you're just around the corner, or you're just away on Umrah. Everybody, Wallah sami'na Sheikhna, Sheikh Hassan, Wallah sami'na Sheikh Hassan. Everybody's like literally that, as if you just had lunch with the Sheikh. And he had an amazing impact. His son Sheikh Abdul Rahman Habannaka wrote many very good books. Rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi. He was living in Saudi in exile. But these biographies, so these practically we should be familiar with them like they're, because these are our exemplars, right? Okay. وَيَجِبُ الْإِيمَانُ إِجْمَالًا بِجَمِيعِ الْمَلَائِكَةِ. It's obligatory to believe in summary in all the angels. وَتَفْصِيلًا بِمَنِ اشْتُهِرَ مِنْهُمْ. And in detail, again, بِحَيْثُ لَا يَصِحُّ إِنْكَارُهُم. That it's not permitted to deny belief in any of them, right? وهم سيدنا جبريل وسيدنا ميكائيل وسيدنا إسرافيل وسيدنا عزرائيل ورقيب وعتيد ورضوان ومالك, right? And these angels, عليهم السلام, and these angels, we need to believe in them. Specifically, not all of them are explicitly mentioned by name in the primary texts. Some are decisively established by function, and the name is transmitted, right? وَأَمَّا مُنْكَرْ وَنَكِيرٌ. Whereas for Munkar and Nakir, the two angels who come with the questioning of the grave, فَلَا يَكْفُرُ مُنْكِرُهُمَا. The one who denies belief in them is not a kafir. لأنه اختلف في أصل سؤال القبر. Because the questioning of the grave, there's اختلاف on بل يضلل, but it's misguidance, because it's ثابت بالمشهور, right? يعني هو ثابت, and there's two opinions, بالمشهور أو بما يشبه التواتر, right? 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 So most of the scholars say there's tawatur, but there has been some ikhtilaf about it. The ikhtilaf is rejected, but so it's a coming together of a whole bunch of evidence. So it's required to believe in the questioning of the grave. But the ulama would not make kufr on something where there's a shubha, walau da'ifa. That's just a point being made, because there are people who are confused who deny it, and some sects of Islam who denied it. So we don't go around deeming people kafir. Right? We don't just say it's fine, believe in it if you want. No, it's established. It's established. It's just good to make a note of this, because the person who denies them is not kafir does not mean that khalas, then I don't need to believe in it. No. It's a belief, it's well established, but because there's a shubhat khilaf, right? There's a shubha, there's a basis for an argument about it. That basis is rejected, but it يدفع التكفير. Right? وقولنا لكن بينهما تلازم, but there's an interrelationship between them. هو الصحيح. This is a sound opinion. ولا يبعده قوله تعالى, and this is not cast off by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying إن المسلمين والمسلمات والمؤمنين والمؤمنات, because that the Muslims, male and female, and the believers, male and female, those who submit, male and female, the Muslimin, and the mu'mineen, male and female. And the argument being that al-atf yaqtadi at-taghayur fil mafhum, that putting two things together in Arabic entails that they're two different. Right? Right? So we say ja'a, if we said that ja'a Sidi Abdul Rahman, ja'a what's your kunya? Yeah. Right? Yeah. جاء سيدي عبد الرحمن وأبو عبده. Right? If we say A wa B, it entails that Abdul Rahman's one person and Abu Abdu is someone else. Right? Right. So this is the issue. That لا يبعده, that this argument is not cast off by saying إن المسلمين والمسلمات والمؤمنين والمؤمنات لأن تغاير مفهوم المسلم والمؤمن كاف في العطف, because the distinction in the meaning of the believer, the one who submits and the one who believes, is sufficient to make atf, and the rest of the verse makes that clear, right? And of the other qualities, because you could have multiple qualities of these, right? فلا يلزم منه مغايرة ذات المؤمن لذات المسلم. This does not entail that the Muslim is someone distinct from the mu'min. ومحل التلازم المذكور أن كان منه انقياد ظاهري وتصديق باطني. And the interrelationship that we've mentioned is when there is both outward submission and inward confirmation. وإلا فلا تلازم بينهما. Otherwise, there would be no interrelationship. بل قد يكون, and this is where the Maturidis would not accept this. And sorry, I keep mentioning the Maturidis because I've been doing a lot of Maturidi work recently in my private space. Right? Preparing for some stuff. But Imam Abu Hanifa's concern was so that people start giving believers grades, that you're a mu'min but you're not a Muslim, or you're not really a Muslim. No. Islam and Iman, and especially when you look at the fuqaha, want to say, okay, are they a believer or not? Say, well, kind of. No. They are, khalas, they're a believer. We act accordingly. لَهُمْ مَا لَنَا وَعَلَيْهِمْ مَا. There are all these things that arise from that. You can't give believers grades. He's a 70% believer. He's a believer, but not really. No. You either are or you're not. You're either Muslim or you're not. The other thing that we could say is that you have Iman, you have actual Iman. If you have actual Iman, then you have actual Islam. The only way you could have one and not the other if it's only apparent. Right? ظاهر الانقياد or ظاهر التصديق. Just apparent. بل قد يكون مؤمنا أي ظاهرا. Right? They could be a believer ظاهرا وليس بمسلم. Right? And this would إن كان معه التصديق ولم يثبت منه نطق. We don't know. So your professor, just because your professor is a good guy, do we say he must be a Muslim? No. Right? We don't know that they've become Muslim, but right? لم يثبت منه انقياد ظاهري, and we have no way of affirming their belief. But in terms of next worldly rulings, they're a believer. وقد يكون مسلما وليس بمؤمن, and they could be a Muslim, meaning apparently. They pray, they fast, وليس بمؤمن, but they don't actually believe. إن كان معه انقياد ظاهري دون تصديق. If they have outward submission without inward confirmation. Well, and you could diagram these various distinctions, the ones in the text and the ones we mentioned, you could diagram them and they become clearer. وهو معنى قوله سبحانه وتعالى ونسأله سبحانه وتعالى الثبات على حقيقة الإيمان والإسلام والإحسان فإنه من أعظم نعمه سبحانه وتعالى. قال تعالى, of course one of the things that really annoy the mashayikh is when people say قال تعالى بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم, because that بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala nowhere says بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. Number one. Number two, in terms of adab al-Quran, if you look in all the, and the ulama have spoken a lot about ahkam of ta'awudh, that, and we have so many hadith where the Prophet ﷺ quoted the Quran in his hadith, in his own words, and he said, قال تعالى, etc. Like the hadith, إن الله طيب لا يقبل إلا طيبا وإن الله أمر المؤمنين بما أمر به المرسلين حيث قال, where are the أهل الأربعين? يا أيها يا أيها الرسل كلوا من طيبات ما رزقنا كلوا من الطيبات واعملوا صالحا. Right? So there is no instance of the Prophet ﷺ saying بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. If you now, when you are speaking consecutively, right, it is good to say the ta'awudh, but you say it to yourself. You say it to yourself. As يشهد له ظاهر السنة. That's what you don't see instances of the Prophet ﷺ saying أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم, such and such, right? It is more strongly recommended to say the ta'awudh when you're going to recite an extensive amount of Quran, but you're making istishhad juz'i. You say لِقَوْلِهِ تَعَالَى إِرْكَعُوا وَاسْجُدُوا. You don't have to pause. لِقَوْلِهِ تَعَالَى إِرْكَعُوا وَاسْجُدُوا. You can just say it in flow. Okay? You're going to quote a whole series of verses, then you say, then it becomes particularly recommended to pause, but you say the ta'awudh inwardly. But to say بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم is far-fetched. Allahu a'lam. قالت الأعراب آمنا. The Arab said that we have believed. قل لم تؤمنوا. Say you haven't believed. ولكن قولوا أسلمنا. But rather say we have submitted. ولما يدخل الإيمان في قلوبكم. But Iman itself has not entered your hearts. فإن المعنى, and there's extensive اختلاف on the possibilities of this verse. فقال الإمام الصاوي رحمه الله وهو إمام في التفسير لم يكن منكم تصديق بالقلب. You have not confirmed with your heart. إنما كان منكم انقياد ظاهري. You just outwardly submitted. ولم يدخل التصديق في قلوبكم فتأمل. So reflect on this. And there's other interpretive possibilities. Right? One is that Iman also is, there's mere Iman and there's true Iman. That's another way. You could divide it into three or you could divide it into two. There's mere Iman, ala taqdeer that the Arab really believed. And there's ikhtilaf, had they really believed? This is on the tafsir that the Arab hadn't really believed. They just said, yeah, we accept. Right? And so the nephew here is, قال الأعراب آمنا إيمانا كاملا. We've believed. قل لم تؤمنوا ولكن قولوا أسلمنا. إنه ما حصل منكم إلا مجرد الإسلام المصحوب بمجرد الإيمان. Which is just, you only have mere Iman. What you don't have, لم تتصفوا بحقائق الإيمان. Because Iman itself entails what? Iman itself entails الخوف والرجاء والشكر والصبر, right? والتوكل والاعتماد. These are the inward أوصاف الإيمان, and it entails outward qualities. لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يحب لأخيه ما يحب لنفسه. Right? Etc. لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى أكون أحب إليه من نفسه وولده ووالده والناس أجمعين, etc. All these different أوصاف الإيمان. So you have mere Islam that don't say, we have believed. And on this taqdeer, it applies to everybody. No, Al-Hasan al-Basri was asked, and it's in Shu'ab al-Iman of al-Bayhaqi, that someone came to Hasan al-Basri, and this is Al-Hasan al-Basri, and said, هل أنت مؤمن? Are you a believer? He said, الإيمان إيمانان. إن سألتني, that if you're asking me, do I believe in Allah and His angels and books and prophets and the last day and in destiny, then I am a believer. لكنك فأنا مؤمن حقا. I'm truly a believer. لكن إن سألتني, that if you ask me, am I of those who, when Allah is mentioned, إذا ذكر الله, what happens? وجلت قلوبهم, their hearts quake. I don't know if I'm a true believer. Right? So this is the other possibility. And the ulama of tafsir, I mean, there's extensive ikhtilaf, but broadly, the taqdeer is, had these Arab really believed? Right? So there's two possibilities. One is, and we mentioned that, فَتَأَمَّلْ. Of course, al-A'rab, it's very common. This is not talking about all the desert Arabs. This is referential. Some desert Arabs said. Okay. والنطق فيه الخلف بالتحقيق. قوله والنطق فيه الخلف إلى آخره. But uttering the shahada, there's difference of opinion on خلف أي اختلاف بالتحقيق. And there's actual اختلاف. هذا مقيد بالكافر الأصلي. This difference is limited to the one who was originally a non-believer. أما أولاد المسلمين فمسلمون. As for the children of Muslims, they're Muslims. ولو لم ينطقوا طول عمرهم, even if they don't utter the shahada all their lives. This is generally true. But not necessarily. Right? For example, even in some Muslim countries, in Syria, okay? I have a friend who, he was seeking my advice, because he's an older guy. This lady really wanted to, it was a complicated situation, because she genuinely didn't know any Muslims. Born in a Muslim family, but father was ultra secular. She was the youngest child. He was like old school, ultra secular. France. She grew up in one of these rich areas outside Damascus. It was like totally ultra secular. She had no clue how to pray. My friend who's a European convert, she noticed him at work and she started asking about, well, there's a complicated situation because she was asking about faith in Allah, etc., and became intrigued in Islam, but she also fell in love with him. It's a big, big problem. So I said, let her talk. Said she was scared stiff of all the ladies. So alhamdulillah, I managed to negotiate, like, don't get yourself in trouble. Because he was quite a lovable, huggable kind of guy. Right? And also seemed safe because he's an older gentleman. So alhamdulillah, I managed to navigate, never meet her alone, never meet her outside the He's also, alhamdulillah, and then managed to hand her over as soon as possible to sensible, balanced women folks, alhamdulillah. No harm came out of it. But there are people like that. I know people who were born, raised in Muslim countries who were born, and what's their haqiqah? إنما نحكم بالظاهر فالظاهر أنهم مسلمون, right? We're not responsible to open people's hearts. Say, well, you weren't Muslim, you were. You weren't Muslim, you were. غير أنهم خالفوا الواجب الفرعي. However, they did not fulfill a derivative obligation. فالكافر الأصلي القادر على النطق وتركه كافر في الدارين. وإن تركه لعذر كخرس أو مات فورا وقامت قرائن دخوله في الإسلام بغير النطق كإشارة مفهمة أو نحو ذلك فمسلم عندنا وعند الله وإلا فمؤمن عند الله فقط. So he says someone who was originally a disbeliever, who was able to say the shahada and who leaves it, is a kafir in this life and the next. This is on the position that the nutq is required. This is one of several positions that you do have to say the shahada. According to some of the ulama, amongst them the Hanafis, أو ما يقوم مقامها, or that which takes the place of the shahada من كل ما يدل على الإسلام قطعا دون شبهة. Right? Right? So if someone just says, look, I believe everything the Muslims believe in and I accept it. Say no. And then they walk outside, they get run over. Say no, they're not Muslim. They just said they were. Right? Someone says, I believe and I accept and I want to live as a believer the rest of my life. And they say, well, let's say the shahada. Say, well, let me show you the translation I have of the Quran. And they parked by Leon's across the road. They ran across the road, they got run over by the bus. They died. Would we say they're a believer? Of course. Or they prayed with us from beginning to end in the Salatul Jama'ah, etc. There's things, and that's discussed by the Hanafis. There's a different opinion about that. So this opinion says that you cannot leave the shahada illa li'udhr. Udhr in our time would be someone in a prominent position or family situation, etc., where they weren't able to make to utter the shahada. So if they leave it, they're a disbeliever in this world and the next, unless left for an excuse. They're mute, or they died right after telling us that they're a believer. But there are sufficient signs, qara'in, indicators that they entered Islam without uttering. Such they gave a clear indication, or the like of it, such as they prayed with us in congregation, for example. So we would consider them Muslim and Allah, and they're Muslim with Allah. Otherwise, they are a believer with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only. Right? Meaning, if they themselves had believed, but we had no indication, Allah considers them a believer, but we need some indicator. So, قوله فقيل شرط كالعمل وقيل بل شطر والإسلام نشرحن بالعمل. So one opinion is that it's a condition. It's a condition. And then those who said it's a condition, one said that al-iman is التصديق بشرط النطق. Right? That it's to confirm it's true on condition that you uttered it. If you didn't utter it on purpose, you're not a believer in the hereafter either. Right? Or the other opinion, interpretation of the shart is, so it's either shartu sihha or shart for us to consider you a believer. Because a believer is someone who is either a believer with Allah or effective faith is someone who's a believer with Allah alone or a believer with Allah and with us. So anybody, and then of course there's apparent belief, we can leave out the other possibilities, but so the relied upon position, which you should, the others you can write them out, the relied upon position is that النطق بالشهادة شرط لإجراء الأحكام الدنيوية فقط. Right? That anyone who confirms is true what the Prophet ﷺ has come with is a believer. The نطق بالشهادة is شرط لإجراء الأحكام الدنيوية. Is for us to consider you a believer. How do I know you're a believer? Unless you state that you're a believer, and the default way is the shahada, or that which takes its place. Right? Someone wrote a tweet, right? So I believe, I have now accepted everything that the Muslims believe without doubt, and I reject my previous beliefs, and they hit enter, but they hit it so hard that they got electrocuted by their keyboard, which they assembled their own mechanical keyboard, and they got electrocuted and they died. They had a heart attack. Small shock, it caused a heart attack and they died. So we see the tweet, right? Or they went on IGTV and they declared, I'm now a Muslim, this and that, and they had a heart attack and they died. We have evidence, right? They didn't say the shahada. So it's الشهادة أو ما تقوم مقامها شرط لإجراء الأحكام الدنيوية. أما عند الله فالتصديق يكفي. That's الإيمان المنجي. Right? So أي لإجراء الأحكام الدنيوية. Right? So أي ليس شرطا ولا ركنا لنفس الإيمان. Right? ويؤيده قوله سبحانه وتعالى أولئك كتب في قلوبهم الإيمان. يعني الإيمان محله القلب. وقوله أي قول النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام اللهم ثبت قلبي على دينك. Right? And there are multiple hadiths about this. قال الإمام الصاوي قال شيخنا الأمير, and he's a very significant person, right? And you should read the biography in the footnote. He has a hashia on Sharh Abd al-Salam. On Sharh Abd al-Salam is a Sharh of Abd al-Salam ibn Ibrahim al-Laqqani on Jawhara al-Tawhid. And it's also known as al-Amir and Hashiyat al-Amir is a really good hashia. The Sharh of Abd al-Salam, the father wrote 3 commentaries, the son wrote several. I don't know, 2 or 3. And there's been recently a nice edition of Hashiyat al-Amir ala Jawhara al-Tawhid. And it has footnotes by, I don't know if it's with but the Sharh of Abd al-Salam, Abd al-Salam al-Laqqani has footnotes by Shaykh Muhyiddin Abdul Hamid, and they're like Shaykh Muhyiddin Abdul Hamid footnotes, they're amazing. Not amazing, they're like very beneficial. Okay. قال الإمام الصاوي رحمه الله قال شيخنا الأمير رحمه الله سمعنا من المشايخ كثيرا أن المدار عند المالكية على أي لفظ يفيد الوحدانية والرسالة. So he said that according to the Malikis, any words that indicate divine oneness and the messengerhood of the messenger are sufficient. ونقله المصنف رحمه الله في شرحه عن الأبي. And the author, meaning Ibrahim al-Laqqani, relates this from the great Maliki Imam al-Ubbi, and al-Ubbi has a sharh on Sahih Muslim. The Malikis had particular interest in Sahih Muslim. A lot of the early work done on Sahih Muslim was done by Malikis. So you have Qadi Iyad and al-Ubbi, and then later as-Sanusi. And of course, very interestingly, one of the earliest commentaries of Hadith and of Sahih Muslim is by a scholar from Malta, in the Mediterranean. You guys can tell me what his name is. Okay. And the author quoted in his commentary, right? This is in Umdat al-Murid, which is now published. It's a 2,400 page commentary on Jawhara al-Tawhid. مخالفا لشيخه ابن عرفة. Now this is an important point. Ibn Arafah, right? And you can read the biography of Ibn Arafah, who died in the year 803 after the Hijrah. I'm reading the right one? Yeah. Right? Imam Ibn Arafah, it's good to have a sense of the biographies of these scholars. Ibn Arafah was one of the teachers of Imam Ibrahim al-Laqqani. Right? Ibn Arafah was the teacher of the teachers of Imam al-Sanusi. Right? And Ibn Arafah had a great influence on his own works in Aqeedah, did not directly become that influential. Although he is a great Imam in Maliki fiqh, he's a great Imam in Usul al-Fiqh, he was also a great Imam in Aqeedah. His own books, his own works in Aqeedah did not become that famous directly, but the influence is through Imam Ibrahim al-Laqqani directly, and also through Imam al-Sanusi, the author of the whole curriculum of Aqeedah studies, both deeply influenced by Ibn Arafah. Ibn Arafah has an amazing work in Kalam called al-Mukhtasar al-Kalami. And the Mukhtasar al-Kalami is published in like 1100 pages. So Mukhtasar means it's a summary of the issues on anything. What's the major opinions of the mutakallimin? He has it. It's way beyond the scope of a work like this, but it's a wonderful, wonderful work. Contrary to Ibn Arafah, al-Mushtarit al-Lafz al-Makhsus, who said that the specific wording is required. وَنَحْوُهُ لِلرَّمْلِ, and the similar opinion is mentioned by al-Ramli وَجَمَاعَةٍ مِنَ السَّادَةِ الشَّافِعِيَّةِ رَحِمَهُمُ اللَّهُ أَجْمَعِينَ وَنَحْوُ مَا لِلْأُبِّ لِلنَّوَوِي. So most of the Shafi'is said you need the specific wording unless you have an excuse. But the like of what al-Ubbi said, that any word is sufficient, has come from Imam al-Nawawi rahimahullah. And it's good to take an opportunity to remember the dates of passing of these scholars. Imam Nawawi, of course, lived only 45 years. And he did all that he did. Rahimahullah. He died 676 Hijri. لكن المصنف رجح التقييد بخصوص هذا اللفظ. However, the author himself chose that the specific words are required. ونقل أيضا الخلاف في الترتيب. And he also related the difference of opinion of the order between the wording. وظاهره تقوية اشتراطه. And the outward is that it's required to maintain the order. Right? That أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. And that's certainly, that is al-ma'hud wal-mutawarith. That's the normal way. But one of the reasons this is good to know, that so what's the hasil? Iman itself, salvific faith, is accepting as true what the Prophet ﷺ has come with. But for you to be but النطق is شرط لإجراء الأحكام الدنيوية. Practically, one of the things that this is useful for in majal of da'wah is many people think, I'm thinking of becoming Muslim. But they have these hang-ups. But you ask them, do you believe in God? He says, yes. Do you believe that the Prophet Muhammad is the messenger of God? He says, yes, I do. I've been thinking about it. That what he's come with is truth from God? Yes. So you're already a believer. You're already a believer. And that's it. So that breaks the hajiz. That, oh, I have to take some big step to become a Muslim. No. It says, and then of course the other hajiz is there's no ishtirat, there's no condition that you make the shahada publicly. Actually, the ulama, if there's a place where ulama are prevalent, turning someone away, say, I want to become Muslim, say, come back on Friday and say it after Jumu'ah. They would say that the person who turned them away, that would be kufr. Why? Because it's ar-rida bil kufr. Of course, we say, well, they're already a believer, like chill out, right? But no, because there's worldly consequences, there's dhulm. You've wronged the person, right? So even if you're a total loser, someone says, I want to be a Muslim, you give the shahada right there. But one step is, and I've seen this repeatedly, that you're already a believer with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala if you believe in the oneness of God, and you accept that the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be on him, is the messenger of God, and that what he's come with is truth from God. You don't have to go into detail, and do you really believe this? Do you really believe that? Do you really this? Welcome. So that's a significant point that it turns a lot of people away. Okay. So he says, fanzur. So look at what's mentioned by the author in Umdat al-Murid. And Umdat al-Murid is available, the PDF is online. It's published in 4 volumes. Some of these works, if you have the opportunity, it's good to get, because once they run out, they run out. Right? And if you're studying a text, it does help to have Bajuri on the Jawhara, to have the Sharh of Abdul Salam on the Jawhara with the Hashiyat al-Amir, and also with the footnotes of Shaykh Muhyiddin Abdul Hamid, etc. قوله كالعمل, right? قيل شرط كالعمل. It said that it's a condition like action. The summary is that there's a condition for the validity of faith. There's شرط صحة الإيمان هو وجود التصديق. It's تصديق. Then there's شرط. Then there's a condition for the presence of faith, which is to confirm it's true. There's a condition for someone being considered a believer when it comes to the worldly rulings, for us to consider them believer, which is the shahadatain, the 2 shahadas, or that which takes their place. The third is شرط لكمال الإيمان. It's شرط كمال, is a condition for the perfection of faith, which is al-amal. Right? So some of the Salaf had said Iman is تصديق وقول وعمل. Or تصديق and nutq and amal. Say yes, they said it, but what does it mean? That Iman is an affirmation in the heart, that's the condition for the validity of Iman. And then there's the affirmation with the tongue, and that is a condition for us considering you a believer, which is either to affirm with the tongue or that which takes its place. And the third is action, and that's a condition for the perfecting of faith. الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات. That's al-amal al-salih, that's what's entailed by faith, but it's not faith itself. And that's very clear from the hadith. The one who doesn't pray, commits zina, lies, cheats, steals, if they accept what the Prophet ﷺ has come with is true, they're a believer. As is clear from the hadith of Abu Dharr, رغم أنف أبي ذر, regardless of how Abu Dharr feels. Right? Even if they, was it? وَإِن? Yeah, even if they commit zina and they steal and lie. Even if, Abu Dharr was shocked, even if, and the Prophet repeated it and says, رغم أنف أبي ذر, regardless of how Abu Dharr's nose feels about it. Right? وقيل شرط في صحة الإيمان والمعتبد الأول, and some said it's a condition for the validity of Iman. قوله كالعمل تشبيه في مطلق الشرطية. The comparison is just in that both have been considered conditions, لأن المختارة عند أهل السنة, because the chosen opinion of أهل السنة أن الأعمال الصالحة شرط كمال الإيمان. Or شرط كمال للإيمان. That the chosen opinion of Ahl Sunnah is that righteous actions are a condition of perfection for Iman. They're not ليست جزءا من مفهوم الإيمان. They're not part of Iman itself. فالتارك لها أو لبعضها من غير استحلال ولا عناد ولا شك في مشروعيتها مؤمن. So the one who leaves righteous deeds, or some of them, without deeming them permissible to leave, استحلال, ولا عناد, nor with rejection, nor doubting that these are legislated, is a believer. مؤمن لكنه عاصٍ, but they are sinful. فوت على نفسه كمال الإيمان, and they missed out for themselves on the perfection of faith. Right? So they're a sinful believer. They're a sinful believer. Right? And this is one of the things that distinguishes Ahl Sunnah from the sects of Islam. That لا نكفر أحدا بمعصية. We do not ما لم يستحلها. We do not deem anyone a disbeliever for a sin that they commit, as long as they haven't deemed what is decisively haram to be halal. And of course, tempting such a person to deem it halal, say, do you really believe that's allowed? And in that moment, someone to justify says, yes, I do. وَلِعَذُ بِاللَّهِ. They hadn't committed kufr. You kufred them. Right? And so you instigated their sin. Maybe they're a simpleton and an ignoramus, they're a fool, and Allah may excuse them. You don't know. But you kicked them out. That's really serious. Okay. So Iman is a singular thing. Iman is not murakkab. According to Ahl Sunnah, Iman is not murakkab, it's a singular concept. You tasdeeq or non-tasdeeq. Okay. وَقِيلَ بَلْ شَطْرٌ. And some said it's a part of faith. Shatr, one part of it. A جزء من حقيقة الإيمان. It's one part of faith. وهذا القول لأبي حنيفة. This is the position of Imam Abu Hanifa. وجماعة من الأشاعرة. And a group of the Ash'aris يقولون إن النطق ركن داخل في حقيقة الإيمان. That the stating the Shahada is an integral that enters the reality of Iman دون سائر الأعمال الصالحة, but not the other actions. And the way there's a lot of controversy even amongst the Maturidis or amongst the Hanafis, what this means. They say this is insofar as the worldly rulings apply. How do we deem you to be a believer? There's two parts to it. But it's not discussing faith itself, but for us to consider your faith. Right? So the ikhtilaf is not real. Of course, now there's one thing, there's a nouveau Maturidism. Right? And these people are so Maturidi, they're denying that there's even a school called the Maturidis. That is only the Hanafi school. And it is like any other newly found thing. Right? And just be careful, because a lot of debates that have been dealt with hundreds of years ago, they're resurrecting old arguments. And that's not good for the ummah. That's not the challenge of our times. And then who are these people? Some of them are hyperactive online. Right? Hyperactive. But just someone has a Twitter account and they say they're speaking on behalf of Maturidism, doesn't mean anything. Right? Thank you for sharing manuscripts. And we check if it's a reliable manuscript or not. But a lot of the pontificating is just that. Like, we don't take the Pope too seriously either, well, with all due respect to whoever, in worldly terms. So, فَالْإِيمَانُ عِنْدَهُمْ اسْمٌ لِعَمَلِ الْقَلْبِ وَاللِّسَانِ جَمِيعًا. So Iman, and this is, according to them, is a name for لِعَمَلَيِ الْقَلْبِ وَاللِّسَانِ, for the actions of the heart and the tongue together. And this is understood with respect to worldly rulings applying. Right? That's a simple way we understand. هذا في غير المعذور. This is for other than the one who has an excuse. وإلا فيكفي التصديق للمعذور اتفاقا. But if the one who doesn't have an excuse, تصديق alone is sufficient for them. فتحصل أن الأقوال ثلاثة. So the summary is that there are three opinions, لكنها ترجع إلى قولين, but they return to two opinions. لأن من قال إنه شرط صحة فقد وافق القائل في المعنى بأنه شطر. Because those who said it's a condition for validity have said essentially what? Those who said that it's a part of faith. شطر, two halves, is a part of faith. وبقي قول ثالث, and there's a third opinion, وهو أن الإيمان مركب من تصديق ونطق وعمل. And there's third opinion, and it's so far-fetched that it's considered separately, that Iman is made up of three parts: confirmation, affirmation, and action. وهو للمعتزلة. And they put themselves in a bind because you must act for you to be a believer. Then what if those who have shortcomings, they tied themselves in knots about those who have shortcomings? And this is also one of the problems of a number of modernist and reformist groups, like our attitudinally divergent brethren. وعليه فمن ترك واجبا, and upon this those who leave an obligatory act like prayer, أو فعل حراما كالزنا, or does something prohibited والعياذ بالله like zina, فهو كافر, they're not a believer. Or they say ليس مؤمنا حقا, they're not truly a believer. Then what are they? And that's what Abu Hanifa feared and others, because you're either a believer or not. Say, well, if you don't pray, you're not really a Muslim. Then what are you? Right? Some of our politically correct attitudinal divergent brethren, they'll say, well, those who don't believe, they're not really Muslim, but we don't call them kafir. Then what are they? Okay, you don't call them kafir because you're worried about your public profile, but some young people will consider them kafir. Right? I met some taxi drivers. One taxi driver in Amman was like, looked like a religious guy, but seemed totally down. I said, Id'i li ya sheikh. So I went through this routine like, why do you think I'm a sheikh? He said, well, Laqqani sheikh. I said, no, just because I'm wearing a taqiyya does not mean I'm a sheikh. So we went, okay, where do you live? And this one of the things the Mashaykh said, connect people to ulama in their area. He said, Yani, where do you live? He lived in this area. I knew one of the local scholars. I said, you should go. He asked, so you go ask. So, you seem not say, what's going on? His son had run away with all his money to Iraq. Why? Because this guy prayed. He used to stop his taxi during the day and pray in the masjid. But he used to work multiple shifts, etc. Sometimes he'd miss Fajr. His son told him, if you don't pray Fajr, you're a kafir. He warned him a second time, third time. He said, well, he's a kafir. His mal is halal. So he took all the lifetime saving, which is not very much. Taxi driver in the Middle East. He had lifetime savings. Certainly he wanted to marry his daughter off and this and that. I don't know what the poor girl's fault was in all of it. Took the money and went to establish the Islamic whatever they wanted to establish in Iraq. It's like 2003, 2004. This kind of thing. Someone says, well, we're saying that someone who leaves prayer is a kafir, but we don't call them kafir. Well, you don't, but others will. Because they say, من قال بقول ألزم بلوازمه, that whoever affirms a matter, whoever states something, is held to its consequences. Okay, that's why what you say about matters of aqidah is so dangerous. وسيأتي للمتن رده بقوله, and the refutation of this will come in detail much further down in the text, in the last third of the book. ولا نكفر مؤمنا بالوزر, we do not deem any believer to be a disbeliever with sin, through wizr, through a contravention. قوله اشرحن بالعمل, and it's interpreted by actions. أي وصحة العمل أي وضحه بالعمل الصالح, make your faith clear but with righteous actions. وامتثال المأمورات واجتناب المنهيات, that is to obey what has been commanded and to avoid what has been prohibited. والمراد الإذعان لتلك الأحكام, and what's meant is to surrender inwardly to those rulings. وعدم ردها, and not to reject them. سواء عملها أم لا, whether one does them or not. And this is one of the things that the ulama would be very careful about, that one has to be very careful about the state of the iman of the public. And each age has its careful considerations. And one of the things is, you don't ever come into a situation where you put someone like gunpoint practice. Do you pray? Because what happens? Say, no, I don't. What are you going to do about it? وَلِعَاذُ بِاللَّهِ. Then you have caused them, and you have to realize that people have egos. So you put them on the spot, they're going to defend themselves, and you're the one who's cast them out. What's the point of fasting if you don't pray? That kind of thing is, especially in our times, there's a context where that could apply. Someone is only doing one thing. I know somebody, the practicing Muslim, the thing that kept them as a believer is that they used to say Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. He was living in a common law relationship with a non-Muslim lady, and she didn't even realize he was Muslim. But when they'd go to a nightclub, they'd go to a bar, and elsewhere, she noticed he mumbled something before he ate or drank. So what did he say? Nothing, just superstitions. He didn't realize he was saying it. That's the one act that he did. So she asked, I just say this expression people say is Bismillah. What does it mean? He didn't even want to talk. It was totally not in mind. But they lived in the married students' residence at the University of Toronto. There's these people who are evidently Muslim. She asked somebody, you guys say this thing before you eat? What is it? Say, that's what my partner says. So she found out, she became interested in Islam. And these women, so she entered Islam. And then she made da'wah to him and he became Muslim. I knew the husband reasonably well. They're sort of, he was used, and I'd met the lady as well. And, لا تستحقرن من المعروف شيئا. The littlest connection, يسروا, facilitate for people to reconnect. ولا تعسر, don't make it difficult. Say, unless you do this, you're not really a believer. لا. Right? And then he says, ومثال هذا, the example of this, الحج والصلاة كذا الصيام فدري والزكاة, will continue. So he says, أي بعد النطق بالشهادتين لأنه لا بد منهما في ثبوت الإسلام. After affirming the shahadas, the examples of these actions are Hajj and Zakat, Hajj and prayer and fasting, so understand, and Zakat. والحاصل, the summary is أن النطق بالشهادتين من الإسلام, that uttering the two shahadas is from submission. وتقدم الكلام عليه, and we've discussed this before. وأن الحج وما عطف عليه ليس بلازم الاتصاف بأدائه بالفعل, and that for you to be considered a Muslim, you don't have to perform Hajj and these other acts for you to be considered a Muslim. Right? For you to be considered a Muslim. بل المدار على الإذعان والقبول. But what being considered a believer, a Muslim, revolves around is إذعان, is surrender to this truth. والقبول, which is التصديق, right? And to accept Iman and Islam. وعدم مقابلتها بالرد والاستكبار, and not to face it with rejection and arrogating yourself. فتأمل, so reflect. And then there's a discussion on whether faith increases or not. نسأل الله سبحانه وتعالى زيادة الإيمان. We stop there. والحمد لله رب العالمين.